Well, I kind of like to look at trends internationally that we're heading towards right now. And I'm going to place this as much as I can within the context of Asia and specifically Hong Kong and China. Here are kind of the trends that we see coming up here. One is to look at more moving towards multi-pollutants and multi-effects rather than just looking at single pollutants. We've been very successful in the US and Europe with single pollutant. But as we discover more, as the levels become lower, we see more secondary formation, we see that we have to look at a broader range of them. We're also seeing a tremendous development in terms of sensors. Bob showed some examples of remote sensing from space, but we also have remote sensing on the ground, and microsensors are now becoming available that can measure pollutants, both in emissions and at receptors. One of the things we've discovered is that many of the tests that we make to certify emissions or to test compliance don't really measure the real world emissions. And so we need to move forward with ways that are more representative of what's really coming out of the different sources. We're looking at cleaner energy sources in the long term as well. While coal is important, we have new rules in the US that are going to put severe limits on the CO2 limitations from power plants. Coal-fired power plants in the future will have to have emissions of greenhouse gases that are similar to those of natural gas-fired power plants. And finally, we need a greater focus on outcomes and accountability. We very often evaluate our effectiveness based on saying, oh, we have catalytic converters, we have scrubbers. But unless we evaluate the actual effectiveness of those, we're not going to make progress on air quality. Well, here's one that maybe shows some of the complexity of trying to relate multiple pollutants to multiple sources to multiple effects. So don't follow all the lines here, just recognize that we have all these different effects on the back end that set people off. Visibility, for instance, and odors, that's what most of the community cares about when they go outside. They see the haze or they don't see the haze. And the important thing to recognize here is that all of these pollutants and all of these sources are interrelated. So unless we start to look at some framework in which we can manage these together instead of as single sources, we're not going to have the effects that we want on the environment. One of the things that's helping us do this is the microsensors, and this is just an example of many types of microsensors that are now available. You can kind of see how your exposure changes to the black carbon soot as you walk around the streets in Xi'an, China. And you can see there's orders of magnitude differences in your exposure depending on where you happen to be. This type of sensor is also something you can use to really identify which the polluters are. Remote sensing is another type of a situation where we can detect, in this case, what the exhaust from different vehicles are. And this is one of the main motivations for improving the inspection and maintenance programs in the United States, was the fact that the real world emissions were not adequately tested by the inspection and maintenance programs. Well, it used to be easier to control pollution because you could see it. And in fact, we still have opacity rules in place. And in fact, that's the first step, is to look to see who's smoking and then to try to reduce those sources. But we find that even once we can't see or polluting, here's a hybrid Prius right here. And if you kind of look in the exhaust pipe, you'll still see some soot that's deposited in there. Yes, the emissions are lower, but it's not emissions free. One of the difficulties we have in the United States is we have a lot of legacy tests. And you can see on the left here, here is how we still test smokestacks. We climb up the smokestack with an ice bucket. We take glass materials up the smoke plant stack, and we test for a single pollutant. So we go up for PM, we go down. We go up again for SO2, we go down. We go up again for NOx, we go down. Not only is this more costly, it doesn't really represent what's going into the air. And so what we're looking at now is switching to something that's more like how we test vehicle exhaust in terms of diluting the sample and then putting multiple devices on them that are similar to what we measure in ambient air. Fortunately, we've worked for the last 5 years to get this new ISO procedure developed. And in fact, this technology has been developed to a certain extent in China. Here's an example of the testing system that's developed at Tsinghua University. So there's no reason to just follow the EPA test methods just because EPA has had them for the last 50 years. It's important to look to the future as to how we can get better representations of what the actual emissions are. These microsensors also give us the possibility of improving our pollution control. Here you can see what happens around a dust and gravel quarry, and how when the pollution controls are turned off, we see orders of magnitude increases in the emissions. Well, if we put these types of data in the hands of the managers, they can use these data to understand when their pollution controls aren't working to improve them. We can also put these in the hands of the inspectors so that they can better detect violations and levy the proper fines that will be an incentive for people to use the proper controls. We're seeing a major change in energy use in the United States. The hydraulic fracturing is really creating an abundance of natural gas, and China has great resources in this area too. Now, while this isn't a perfect solution to greenhouse gases, it is a transition that will allow us to try to use energy more cleanly and more efficiently while we go to more renewable types of sources. We also see that there are opportunities for co-benefits, for effects on health, effects on climate, effects on ecology that add to the cost benefits when we consider the effects beyond just health. To put this in perspective, let's look at an example that came up at our conference here, and this is the one that compared the catalytic converters on the taxis to new catalytic converters. And you can see on the left there that not only did the catalytic converters not meet the emission limits, they were grossly above the emission limits. And you can see what happens when the catalytic converter was replaced. It was practically not there. So there was this assumption. All our cars have catalytic converters, but there was no accountability. There was nothing built into the system to demonstrate that these were actually doing the job. And you can expand this to other places. For example, we see high sulfate levels. Yet people say, oh, all of our coal-fired power plants in China have SO2 scrubbers on them. Well, if they're all functioning and they're all efficient, why do we have such high sulfate levels? So without that accountability, we're in no position to say that we're going to have the effects. Well, as a final thought, I thought I'd relate some of my own experience with home improvement. You know, in the United States, craftsmen are very expensive. It costs $100 just for the plumber to drive in your driveway, and he hasn't done anything. So we have these big box stores, Home Depot and Lowe's, where we go down and we try to mess it up ourselves, okay? And here's the thing we found out. That when you're trying to do home improvement, there's no such thing as a small job. It takes at least 5 trips to Home Depot to get all the parts and other things you need. Everything takes longer and costs more than you thought it would. But the fact is that you can do it. And we've seen examples throughout the world where even though it costs more, even though it was harder than we thought it was, we can make progress toward cleaner air and a healthier environment.